So welcome to Tea Time. Today's subject is inequality. We have an extraordinary speaker with us that is Professor Ravi Kanbur. So I'll pass the now to Nitin and Abhishek, who will start.
Thank you, Professor Lourdes. My name is Nitin Bajaj. I'm a first-year MBA student, and Abhishek is also a first-year MBA student. We're very privileged to have Professor Ravi Kanbur with us today, who is a T.H. Lee Professor of World Affairs, International Professor of Applied Economics and Management, and Professor of Economics at Cornell, where he specializes in development economics, public economics, and economic theory. Professor Kanbur has also previously served as a senior member of the World Bank staff as a chief economist of Africa. So we're very privileged to have Professor Ravi, and perhaps you could start us off by talking a little bit about inequality, and then we can ask you particular questions.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed, Nitin and Abhishek, and of course, Lourdes. It's a great pleasure to be here. I thought maybe I could just start off saying a few things about the issue of inequality and what we see happening in the world around. And of course, it's now at the top of the agenda, top of the policymakers' agenda, top of the public agenda, all of those sorts of things. And I suppose it's been driven a lot, certainly in the West, by the rise in inequality as conventionally measured in the US. Say the share of the top 1% or the share of the top 10% has all been rising for the last 25, 30 years or so. And in Europe as well, although in Europe it's mitigated somewhat by different policies and so on. So, and then we ask the question, what's happening in the rest of the world? Are these trends to be seen in the rest of the world? And so on. So it's a very lively area just now. It's a very live area of research, of policy discourse, and so on. So in my own writings, I've emphasized the technological trends that the world is facing. In particular, this massive sort of shift in technology, which is displacing basic labor in favor of capital and in favor of skilled labor. Now, basic economics tells you that if these trends continue on a business as usual scenario, either wages will fall at the lower end and will rise at the upper end, and thereby creating inequality, or if wages don't fall at the lower end, there'll be high unemployment. So in the US, where wages are relatively flexible, wages at the lower end have fallen. In Spain, where wages are relatively inflexible, youth unemployment exceeds 20% and 25%. So whichever way you cut it, these trends on a business as usual scenario will lead to rising inequality. And that's a sort of a basic core thing. And of course, inequality has been rising in the US and to some extent in Europe, etc. The question is this a global phenomenon? And it turns out actually it's not fully a global phenomenon in the following sense. If you look at the data for Latin America, in the last 25, 30 years, Latin America, which used to be the poster child of high inequality has actually been falling in Latin America for the last 25 to 30 years. And that's quite strange in a way, and we have to ask the question why. And as I can argue later on, it's to do with government policy. If you look at other countries, in big countries in Asia, like India or China, or Bangladesh or Vietnam, there in fact the trend is similar to that in the West. Inequality has been rising. So the question is why? Why are there these differences? Or in Africa, I should say, it's a mixed pattern. Some countries it's rising, other countries it's falling, similarly in the Middle East and so on. So why? And I think what's happening, what's coming between this technological trend and the outcome? And the answer has to be policy, has to be government policy. It's either exaggerating these trends, as some would argue in the US, where, for example, the tax system has become less progressive over time, or actually leaning against this wind, which people have argued is what happened in Latin America. In Latin America, through various policy interventions, they began to increase their supply of skilled labor to match this demand-side shock, if you like, and therefore manage it that way. But they also did other things like minimum wage policy and redistribution and so on and so forth. So the key point that comes out in my writings is that policy matters. There's this trend, technology, but policy intervenes between that and the outcomes. And that, I think, is the sort of scenario. Even if we take the case of China, and I'll conclude with that, where our work and other people's work has shown that for the last, since the start of the reform, since about the mid-1980s, inequality rose very sharply for about 25, 30 years. even in China, we would say in the last 10 years, our work is beginning to show that inequality is beginning to plateau and maybe a little bit turn down. It depends, one shouldn't celebrate it too much because it's still very high. But nevertheless, it's beginning to plateau and it's beginning to turn down. And we in our work related again to government policy, where the government said enough is enough, and we now need to do something. So that's a sort of class of questions that I'm investigating in my work. Thank you.
I mean, if I could just ask, you talk about the policy solutions, and one of the big policy solutions that you talk about is on a global level that perhaps we look at setting minimum corporate taxes throughout the world. But it seems to me that's one of the really tough things to do, even within a country. Do we have the political capital today to do that on a global scale? And if not, what are some of the short policy steps that we can take to get us there?
Yeah. Again, it's a very, very, very good question. So let me just step back a little bit and ask, in very broad terms, what are the policy interventions that one can do, given this massive trend of technological change? Okay. Let us, for the moment, take that trend as being given. Let us assume that we can't do anything to change it. And I'm going to come back to that, okay? Then they seem to me to be, and since I characterized it as, if you like, a demand-side shock in the labor market, where it's reducing the demand for basic labor and increasing the demand for skilled labor, one answer is obviously that you shovel on the supply side, that you create more skilled labor, that you turn all these unskilled workers into skilled workers. And if you could do that overnight, of course, many have argued that has been part of the Latin American success, but only part of the Latin American success. Because just think about it, okay? If we started today to begin to create this new skill set, it would take us 15 years, 20 years through the education system to do this thing. And so what are we going to do about the 45-year-old unemployed steel worker whose job has been lost and is not coming back? Okay? So the supply side story is a very important one. Indeed, it has paid off and it will pay off, but it can't be the full story. Okay? So then the second type of question you ask yourself is what you do then is, well, maybe you then redistribute after the event, after the market plays out. If social tensions and so on are problematic for you as a policymaker, then you try to redistribute. And there's a lot of discussion of this in terms of the universal basic income versus employment creation schemes and so on. And I think a lot of context matters a lot, and it's country specific, and some schemes are better in some countries, other schemes are better. But that's the general sort of thing. But for all of these things, for both of these things, creating the supply side stuff or the redistribution, you need government revenue. You need government revenue. And if there is then tax competition around the world, which is actually lowering government revenue, this I have argued in my writings, if you like, is the other main feature of the world in the last 25 years, 30 years. Because of globalization, because of freer movement of capital, which has obviously very, very positive, a very positive side to it in terms of efficiency and so on. There is this very strong negative side to it, which is that it creates a race to the bottom on tax rates. So for any one country, it wants revenue. And we hope it uses it well in terms of the way the Latin Americans have done and so on. But in order to get more revenue, it tries to lower its tax rates to attract business from outside. But of course, every country is doing the same. Every country is doing the same, and that's the problem. It's the race to the bottom issue. Now, by the way, I should say, you have to give you an example. If you have a corporate sitting in Singapore, going to the Indonesian government saying, you lower your tax rates, or we're going to move to Malaysia. But of course, it's saying the same thing to the Malaysian government. And what you see factually is that certainly statutory corporate tax rates have been going down. Enforced corporate tax rates have always been low, but even statutory corporate tax rates have been going down over the last 15 years or so. So I think that's an issue. So if I present that as a problem, then I think we have to begin to think about a solution to that problem. And to say that global institutions are weak and can't address this, that's obviously true. But if we say, well, that's that, then we can't move any forward, and we'll just get into this spiral of more inequality. Every government trying to raise more revenue, but of course it ends up with less revenue, and then we have this. Now, again, in my other writings on global institutions, like the World Bank and other global institutions, I've argued that these institutions, like the World Bank specifically, which was created 75 years ago this year, by the way, 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, on the one hand, two economists, John Maynard Keynes on the one hand, and Harry Dexter White, who was Roosevelt's right-hand man at the conference, together designed the world, the economic world, so to speak, where they saw a particular problem. The problem was that infrastructure in Europe and Japan had been bombed out, and of course, when the war was won, they would have to address this issue. But all the funds were in Wall Street, in US. And there was no intermediation taking place, and therefore they created this institution which would intermediate between sources of funds and uses of funds. And the particular instrument, which was Keynes's brilliant creation, was a sovereign loan with mutual and several guarantees. But it's a country-specific loan. It's to address a country-specific problem, and it's obviously succeeded very well because, in many ways, the first 30 years after the Second World War, known as the golden age of capitalism, owes at least partially to these sorts of institutions. But that perspective and those instruments which they created did not address cross-country spillovers and so on, because that wasn't thought to be the issue at the time. And you just think about a sovereign loan. A sovereign loan is something which is given to a country and the country pays back. That's the whole point about a loan, is you know who's taking it and you know who's paying it back. Okay? But when you have these spillover effects, where my action affects your action, affects your outcome, and your action affects my outcome, and so on and so forth, the instruments of 1944 are no longer the instruments that we now need. Okay? And in many ways, one would say that the institutions of 75 years ago, 3/4 of a century ago, are not the institutions that we now need. So I think we have to now start thinking along those lines. Now, it's obviously true that things are set, and it's difficult to break out of these things, and maybe we'll just stumble along for the next 20 years. Corporate tax rates going down, and so on and so forth. But I think unless we begin to think big about these things, we'll always be faced with these sorts of issues.
Yeah, I wonder if we could bring both Abhishek and Nitin in this discussion, because they are, both of them, the new elite. They will have to solve this problem. They are in a business school where we, of course, advocate for lower corporate taxes. And I think Ravi has done a brilliant exposition about the issues. So what is your view? We, as I said, we advocate for low corporate taxes. Where is the middle ground? And where are the new institutions, new thoughts after 75 years of the World Bank?
You know, I'll be honest, I go to a business school and I think to myself, and I hear this argument all the time, that some of the factors that contribute to inequality also, and free marketeers and laissez-faire people make this argument all the time, that the factors that contribute to inequality also kindle the free spirit of the markets that lead to higher productivity, more innovation, more entrepreneurship. And I find myself in a confounding position, and maybe I can counterpose this question to both of you. If a Fortune 500 CEO of, let's say, a rather innovative company comes to you and says, this is what we've done over the last 20 years. Look at the wages where they've gone. Look at the GDP. We have contributed to the economy. How do you counter that argument of inequality?
So, Abhishek, did you have something to say before I leap in?
You can answer that, but I have a different question, right? My question is more from an India standpoint, because I've been working in India and in the rural markets. One argument that I always see getting asked is that India has been the fastest or second fastest growing country for a long time now. But that growth is not reaching the lower strata of the population. And despite the best of government interventions, right, and obviously there are corruption and pilferage and all those things happening. But one idea mooted was around universal basic income. But then there were detractors of that as well, both in policy making and outside of policy making. So since you mentioned the point of universal basic income, I would like to understand from you that how can a fast growing country like India implement something like that? Is that the solution, or is that not the solution? Because in my mind, that will create some short-term gains, but in the long term, you're likely to lose the incentives that people have, like the skilled laborers have, to contribute to the economy or to contribute to the greater good of the society. So would love to hear that take, but obviously after
Sure. Lourdes, did you have something before I
What I am, of course, I'm in a business school. I'm a firm believer that the private sector is the one driving, is one of the very important drivers of innovation, growth, job creation, wealth. And I've studied emerging markets, so I am a firm believer that in emerging markets, you need this vibrant, and that is one of the things that China has understood. China has a vibrant private and state-owned sector that drives all this wealth and all this growth. The question is, and I've seen it many times in emerging markets, I've seen it in India, I've seen it in Latin America, is that this social commitment very often is part of the DNA of these companies in emerging markets. The question, as Ravi is saying, is that now inequality, strangely enough, has moved definitely to the US, and definitely I lived in France for very long, and now we have this gilets jaunes, so saying we are destitute in a country in which, yes, there is a lot of corporate taxes and taxes in general. So I think there is some kind of correction on the way that needs to be done all over the world, because the private sector has to recover a little bit of that spirit of the founders, that the founders of many of these companies, I've seen it in emerging markets, really had the growth of the sustainable development of their own countries in their minds. So on the way, I think this maximizing shareholder value has been, I think, too short-sighted, because at the end of the day, any industry, any sector, any company grows with the economic development of the country. Their growth is linked to the economic development of the country. If you maximize shareholder value without an eye on what is happening in the society, you are looking for the short term and forgetting the medium and the long term, because, of course, these people that cannot access to the middle classes, these middle classes that have been the engine of growth, have been the engine of consumption, then I think we are for a recipe of disaster in the medium and the long term.
Good. So let me, these are very, of course, very, very good points indeed. And let me respond that you mentioned shareholder value. In fact, last year we had a panel in the College of Business, a faculty college-wide panel on the topic shareholder value versus social values, friends or enemies, and so on. Okay, so different people. And the point is that this debate, this discussion, is an age-old discussion. It's not something that happened. It happened this last year or whatever. You go back to the 18th century and you go back to the writings of Keynes in the early part of the 20th century. You go back to the writing of Pitt in the 18th century. All these discussions are there. Sort of the balance between market and state is a classic sort of. And Edmund Burke, the great British philosopher, said that this is one of the finest problems of political economy. I think some word like that. And then he was writing in the 18th century. So it's a no. So let me just kick off by giving the example of China, where, as I said, I was part of a movement 25 years ago, pointing to rising inequality in China. Okay, and we showed inequality is rising very fast indeed. And when we presented that result, and it was actually joint work with Xiaobo Zhang, who's a Cornell PhD and is now actually a distinguished professor at Peking University. When we presented that, we had a lot of pushback from places like the World Bank and others saying, we've had the fastest growth rate in human history. We've had the largest poverty reduction in human history, all of which are true. And here you come spoiling the party. And the way that we presented our work then was actually in positive analytic terms, not normative, saying this is good or bad. We're saying, just like if you don't understand the rate of inflation in a country, you don't understand the economy of the country. Similarly, if you don't understand the evolution of inequality in a country, you don't fully understand the economy of the country. Yeah? That was how we presented it. And then, as I said, in the last 10 years, we've shown that actually this has begun to turn down. So, And now, of course, the pushback we're getting is from the NGO saying, how can you possibly say that inequality in China is turning down? When I walk down the streets, I see these vast mansions and so on and so forth, etc. So again, we say, look, these are the facts, so to speak. Let's talk. But what's interesting is how we conceptualize what has actually happened. Why is it that there's been this turnaround? And there's no question that it's government policy which has been at the heart of this. You mentioned India. There's a sort of an apocryphal tale, perhaps, of Manmohan Singh, who was the Prime Minister of India, and actually was the finance minister when the economic liberalization was launched. But before he became finance minister, when he was out of office, he was the head of a global NGO of some sort. I think it was called the North-South Group or something like that, North-South Commission. So they visited China and they met with Deng Xiaoping and said Manmohan Singh was an old social democrat, said, but sir, all these reforms, don't you think they will lead to an increase in inequality? And Deng Xiaoping said, I certainly hope so.
That's a good answer.
So he understood these trade-offs. He understood that this is what you would need to do this thing. But 25, 30 years down the road, it's not the NGOs who have made the government of China change this thing, their stance. It's the fact that rising inequality has led to social cohesion issues within China. I don't need to tell you about all the issues in the inland regions and so on and so forth, and I don't need to tell you about the disturbances in urban areas, etc. It is that which has made the government shift, now to a different tack. So in some sense, there are these correctives within, and in a society like China, which obviously doesn't have standard elections in the sense that the West would understand it, and nevertheless, these things matter because the ruling elite realizes that their own survival, the survival of society, depends upon doing something about this. So I think, and this is, I think this is the framework this is the sort of frame that I usually use, which is how much does the society as a whole think they can get away with? At this stage now in the US, with this increase in quality, can we go on making the argument? Can we go on making the argument that make the tax system even less progressive? Why? Because innovation and growth will eventually solve these things. Okay. I don't think that'll fly politically. Just as a cold analytical proposition. So leave aside the normative stuff of inequality is bad or whatever it is. It's will the growth process survive? Will the innovation process survive these things? So that's one way that I would approach this thing. And of course, I have other normative approaches as well, philosophical approaches as to why inequality might be of concern. But let's not in a college of business. Let's just think about innovation and the impact of social cohesion on that. So now we come to your question, Abhishek, about universal basic income and so on. And this is so first of all, the point is that the Indian government has realized something has to be done about this. That's the thing. So the debate is not about whether you do something or not. The debate is about what should be, and different scheme, different whatever, and so on. And there's a big discussion on the nitty-gritty policy stuff as well in this thing. So on universal basic income, I'm instinctively a universalist, okay, in the sense that anything which is more finely targeted and so on, which you can show is quote unquote more efficient fiscally, because of course you take the money and use it where it's needed, etc., etc. But in my writings, I've shown that actually this sort of benefit always comes with a cost. Comes with the administrative costs of doing this thing very finely. It actually comes with incentive costs. Because if you say to somebody, we will only give you this transfer if your income is below the poverty line, which is the finely targeted scheme by definition, right? Well, what are the incentives of that person in going above the poverty line? Right. Okay. On the other hand, if you say we're going to give a uniform, irrespective of whatever your labor supply is, okay. Now you may say, well, that means a person won't supply the labor and so on. Well, compare that to the alternative, where in effect you're imposing a 100% marginal tax rate at that boundary. You're saying $1 more than the poverty line, and we reduce our transfers by $1. That's an effective 100% monitoring. So there are all these sorts of issues, but quite often I think it turns on the specific detail of these things. Now, in the Indian context, there's a sort of some political economy type stuff as well, which is that the actual mechanism that we have, for example, the food distribution system and so on and so forth in India, which is hugely corrupt, hugely inefficient and so on, we know all that, okay? But there's a mechanism in place. There's a mechanism in place through which households can go to the ration shop and get this thing as of... and you can see those people who are concerned about the outcomes for the poor saying, so you're saying to me, we're going to get rid of this and bring in something which you think is going to be better, okay? This is, I know it's not working well, but at least it's working, it's doing something. So it's those sorts of nitty-gritty things, I think, which matter in terms of these detailed policy discussions. But in terms of broad concept, I'm instinctively for a more universal approach rather than a fine targeting approach.
We are coming to the end. Abhishek, you
yes, I had a question on that. Since the policy instrument in different countries vary by incentives for the government to do and policy changes, so would you say that the onus is now on the private sector to kind of take some concrete steps in order to pitch in where the government probably can't do it, and maybe there's got to be a not collusion but probably a collaboration between the government and the private sector in order to at least ameliorate this in the short term?
Yeah. So of course this leads us into another very big discussion in terms of corporate social responsibility and so on, which Lourdes alluded to, and whether that can, so to speak, do the job, or whether in fact it's that the alternative view is let the private sector do its job, which is to maximize profits, and then for the state to regulate and do taxes and so on in order to. But the notion of in some sense, using the private sector to achieve these aims, the state using it through the design of incentives and targets and so on and so forth, including, I would say, corporate social responsibility. Because you say in India again, there's a sort of a tax concession given for corporate social responsibility, okay? And one can imagine designing that tax thing in a way that achieves the government's objectives, rather than saying, you tell me whatever it is, you can label whatever you want as corporate social responsibility and we'll give you a tax break for that. Okay. So let me just conclude this line saying that although we have these big picture discussions on inequality and so on, so the actual implementation on the ground has to be very country specific and very culture specific. Okay? So let me conclude by giving you an example of this universal basic income, the notion of receiving a check from the government is treated very differently in different cultures. In Alaska, by the way, all Alaskan natives families receive a check from the government. It's called the Alaska Permanent Fund. Okay, it's from the natural resources. The great socialist scheme of actually sending every citizen a dividend on this thing. It's called the Alaska Permanent Fund. Okay, there's no sort of stable, well, this destroys incentives, this whatever, and so on. The citizens of Alaska consider this to be their right, and this is the whatever. But on the other hand, in other contexts and other cultures, it is indeed an issue of receiving something for which society deems you haven't worked. Okay. So again, the example I give is of the Midwestern steel worker who loses, let's say, $1,000 because the job is gone. Okay. The question now is, what do you do? The economist's prescription is the most efficient way of addressing this is to give $1,000 in cash, because any more indirect way has losses along the way, has efficiency losses along the way. Okay. But and of course, the steel worker would rather have $1,000 than not have $1,000, but that is not considered to be a dignified form of receiving the transfer. And similarly, in South Africa, when you have a public employment scheme, and you can design, it's a very efficient way of transferring these things, targeted, etc. But people don't consider it to be a dignified form of receiving the 100 rands, going down the highway, collecting rubbish, and so on. Okay. And we as economists face those constraints now when we move into the realm of actually designing concrete policies in this thing. So over and above the UBI versus targeting and so on, there are these which one can discuss in the economic context. there are also these cultural issues, which I think one has to bring the general economic principles to bear in the specific context of a particular country.
Okay, a very important subject. We are coming to the end of the time, so we have to stop it, but we are looking forward to have a great discussion next Monday on your panel that we will be attending, and it's a subject that will come back to it because, as you say, is tremendous, is very much current. Everybody is talking about it because it's increasing in many parts of the developing and developed world. So thank you so much, Ravi, Nitin, and Abhishek, for a very interesting discussion, and looking forward to continuing offline, online. Thank you all.
Thank you.